Well, to try and figure out how we could address this subject of change and how the environment is changing, myself and the panel members spent quite a bit of time discussing what were the changes and what they meant for us all. And then, as you'll see, we tried to break it down into some pieces to have some topics that we felt were reflective of the changes. So who is the panel? Well, you've heard about myself. I'd like to introduce the rest of my panel, who are all friends over the years and people I've had great pleasure working with professionally and enjoying a few things socially as well. First of all, there's Gokul, Chaudhri. Gokul's in Taxand, India. He's a tax partner there, and he specializes in particular in energy and infrastructure. Then we have, after that, we have Kevin. Kevin's a partner in Taxand, China. He's based in Shanghai. He specializes in international tax. Then we have Jaime. Jaime, among his many qualities, he's the global leader of the compensation and benefits service line within Taxand. And then we have, at the end, last but not least, Ernie Perez. Ernie's a partner in Taxand US, and he spends his life between Miami, New York, and whatever airport he's in. He's also head of the transaction tax service line for Taxand in the US. So that's the panel, and briefly to describe what we're going to try to cover today. We broke it into three pieces. The first one is less is more. What does this mean? It sounds like a kind of alchemy or magic. And there is a bit of that because, as we'll see, to some extent, it's what governments have to do at the moment. They somehow have to manage to create more taxes while at the same time, in very specific areas, charging less taxes. The next one then is show me the money. Other than Tom Cruise jumping up and down and shouting this, there's a lot of tax authorities out there that are doing something similar in perhaps a less expressive way, but in a very serious way. And here we'll be really focusing on what are the changes in law designed to try and raise more revenue, in addition to the policy changes we've described in the first part. The last part, private taxes, public morality, this was an additional twist we felt. The first two, if you like, are very kind of legal, financial. They're areas that we, as tax lawyers, as finance people, are relatively comfortable with. There's laws, there's policies, there's uncertainties and risks, but we can kind of manage them. We can generally put them on a spreadsheet. The last area has been one that's been evolving over the last few years, and I have a file at home where I keep press clippings, and I'll show you some of them afterwards. And they're press clippings where I see taxes being raised as a public issue way beyond the business section of the papers, and they suddenly become a public policy issue, a public morality issue. And that file has been growing fast over the last couple of years, so we'll spend some time on that. So how did we get to all of this? To some extent, the change in the environment, and particularly the tax environment over the last years, has been a product of some fairly obvious and very visible global economic events. First of all, we had a global meltdown, which governments had to spend huge amounts of money to basically plug the gaps left, largely by the finance industry, but they were assisted in that by lots of other industries. So what have the governments had to do? They've had to cut costs very heavily. At the same time, they're trying to increase tax revenue. And one of the mantras is, well, to increase tax revenue, the most painless way of doing it is to grow your way out of the problem. Now, I think the recent announcements from the UK and the US in the last few days indicate that the projections from growth, or the projections of growth, are a little less rosy than they were. So the easy way, which is to grow your way out of the problem, maybe isn't so easy or realistic after all. So there's got to be other ways to increase tax revenue. And we'll see there's a kind of a paradox here, because on the one hand, all the states are trying to encourage business and enterprise in their countries. On the other hand, they have to try and raise revenue. So we'll see what they're trying to do. And then finally, you've got to reduce debt, because most major developed states are heavily indebted at the moment, and the only way they can ultimately reduce debt is by raising revenues to pay down that debt. So that's the context, if you like, from a global position. And it really is a paradox. And when we were going around the world and looking at the different problems and issues we had in the different regions, a number of themes kept coming back. And that's finally how we decided to break it down in this area. Because it's true, some states may be close to bankruptcy, others may have to worry about asset bubbles, but the same themes keep coming back. How can you cut rates but make businesses more competitive? How can you attract more enterprise to your country? How do you do all of this while at the same time managing a budget? In Luxembourg, our Prime Minister is famed for once saying to other Prime Ministers, he said, let's be honest, we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get elected afterwards. I think that's probably not true anymore, because I think now the problem has shifted, because now governments are genuinely saying we don't necessarily know what to do, and we're trying some things out. And that's one of the things we'll look at as part of this panel is, how has this worked in the past? And some of this flowed from a study that was done by Taxand France, where they polled 20 or 30 countries and said, what are the emerging policy themes? And the first one that really emerged very strongly was that in the corporate tax area, lots of governments, and it's the majority, are trying to cut the rate. And obviously if they cut the rate, they have to get the revenue from somewhere, so the answer is they broaden the base. And one of the interesting things we thought about was, well, has this worked before? You know, what are the effects of it? And the first area I'd like to cover, and I'd like Gokul to comment on this, is India, because India, if you like, has been a case where this has been tested. I'd just like to wrap this up now, because I'm conscious, trying to stick somewhat to time. To try and wrap this up, what does this all mean? The policy shift that we've seen is basically governments trying to square the circle. How can they reduce corporate tax rates to encourage more business to come to their country, to encourage enterprise, while at the same time plugging the deficits? And the answer is, well, let's broaden the base. And I think that has consequences for all of us, is to figure out what that actually means for our companies. So I think there's an area there of reviewing tax strategy. Then we have the legislation and the enforcement against avoidance. And there I think the mantra that comes back is substance, substance, substance. Tax planning nowadays has to be more than boxes on paper. It has to be reviewed very carefully to make sure that everything in there has motive and has physical substance. And then finally, there's the reputation part, which I think over the next years is going to gain in prominence. And there I think the way we have to start thinking about it is that, you know, tax risk used to be something very financial that we could manage. Now a subset of tax risk is PR. And to some extent, I think going forward, we'll all as tax professionals, as finance professionals, almost start to have to welcome in the PR agency into the discussion on taxes and tax strategy. So with that, I'd like to thank my panel members for their contributions. I found them very interesting as always, and I'd like to thank you all for your attention.